Sup, fools? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be discussing the Valsalva Maneuver. This will be a comprehensive review of what the Valsalva Maneuver is, how it functions, its physiological happenings inside the body, which is actually really complex and really interesting. And we're also going to be covering the safety. So if you are a lifter, if you poop a lot, well, if you poop in general, then you're going to want to know what the Valsalva Maneuver is. So this is applicable to you, to anyone who poops and anyone who does any sort of heavy resistance training. With that said, everything that I talk about in this video is also in my article in far more detail. I've got my peer-reviewed research that is linked below in that free article as well. And that's that. Let's get it. What is the Valsalva Maneuver? The Valsalva Maneuver, let's keep going, is the technical or proper term for bearing down, if you've ever heard of that expression. So if you're using the restroom and you're constipated, you bear down to release that poop into the toilet. That is the Valsalva Maneuver. And if you're a lifter, then you're probably pretty aware of actually creating the Valsalva Maneuver on a daily basis when you lift. So what is it in physiological terms? Valsalva Maneuver is when you pull in air and then you close your glottis. So it's not really something that you just think, I'm closing my glottis now. I mean, we're not robots, but you pull in air and instead of releasing that air, you then close your glottis and you push up against that air, then pushes up against that glottis. That creates intra-abdominal pressure and thoracic pressure. Intrathoracic pressure. So that pressure builds up between those two areas, the abdominal wall and then the thoracic, and then that creates a greater stability, or that's what's thought. And that actually is the case. A lot of lifters use it for force production because they think that it is going to increase their force production. However, the research seems to indicate that not likely. It seems that Valsalva Maneuver does not increase force production. However, there is a caveat to that. I do not know if that research is necessarily fully telling of what the Valsalva Maneuver is capable of doing or providing for us, because the Valsalva Maneuver is basically necessary for any loads that are over 80 to 85% intensity of 1 rep max, or rep max in general. So are there benefits to the Valsalva Maneuver in terms of lifting? Probably, but the research has looked and seems to indicate that no, it has no impact on force production, although it does do an adequate job, a good job, of increasing our pressure within that abdominal wall and that thoracic section of our body. So force production, a little bit on the insecure side. We're not really 100% certain, but I would say that anything below 80% intensity, Valsalva Maneuver does not have an impact, and anything over 80% intensity, we still have to determine, but it is necessary for us to use the Valsalva Maneuver to really get to that 80%. So I would assume that the Valsalva Maneuver would have some impact on force production, even if it is in an indirect manner. Now, in terms of how it functions, we are going to switch to a blackboard method so I can explain the 4 different stages that make up the Valsalva Maneuver. Let's go ahead and do that. So when we look at the Valsalva maneuver, we look at 4 different stages typically. Some look at 5 stages, some look at less stages, but we're going to look at the 4 typical stages that our body goes through in physiological changes that our body goes through in terms of the Valsalva maneuver. So we see this increase in pressure inside the body, which is done by inhaling air, and then this air creates pressure by pushing up against different areas inside the body, known as intrathoracic pressure. And that pressure is also exerted up against a closed glottis. So we have to actually close our glottis and our throat to be able to create this pressure. So we have this intrathoracic pressure, so our body pressure goes up. So this ends up leading to a bunch of physiological changes that occur within the body in terms of our heart and our neural system and our brain. Actually, there are different areas of our physiological system that end up having to change because we create this pressure inside of our body. So one of those changes is an increase in blood pressure. And I'll go a little bit more into why that occurs later on, but we have an increase in blood pressure, and as a result we also have a decrease in our heart rate. And that's all made possible, or at least partly made possible, by our baroreceptors. Our baroreceptors are part of a baroreflex arc, which are basically, in very simple terms, you can look at a baroreceptor as just a stretch reflex. So a stretch reflex that's typically found in the aorta and the carotid arteries. Those are the 2 main areas that people talk about when they're talking about a baroreflex or baroreceptors. And the way it works is if you've got an increase in blood pressure, the baroreceptors are able to perceive this sudden increase in stretch, and they send a neural signal to the brain, and then we end up having our nervous system trying to attenuate that stretch in the arteries. And that stretch in the arteries then leads to either vasodilation or vasoconstriction of those arteries. So we see an increase or decrease in the size of those arteries in terms of their diameter. Now, going back to why that has to occur, why we see a sudden increase in intrathoracic pressure, and why that leads to an increase in blood pressure as well as a decrease in heart rate to attenuate that blood pressure, is if we look at this. We look at pressure outside of the blood vessels, outside of the arteries, which is over here, is this air pressure, this pressure that we've built up manually. And this ends up enacting on the actual walls of the arteries, and for that, the reason why that's an issue is because it ends up leading to all kinds of different issues that could possibly happen. You could have breaks in these arteries if you have this external pressure. So again, this area in here, this external pressure of the arteries ends up being too strong. So what happens is our body then increases the pressure inside the arteries to become similar to the external pressure. So the external pressure and the internal pressure then equilibrate to a point where then they can be on the same page, and we have an equal amount of tension or force being pushed down or pushed against those arteries. And that's the main reason why we see an increase in blood pressure. Stage 2 is basically a continuation of Stage 1. Stage 1 would be considered an initiation or an initial stage, and Stage 2 would be a continuation of that initial stage. So blood pressure is not an immediate reaction. It's not something that just happens within a millisecond or two. It takes a few seconds for it to regulate. So again, if we've got this increase in this intrathoracic pressure, that means that we've got an increase in pressure around the heart. So the issue is that the body's not just trying to protect the heart, it's also trying to protect this vasculature outside of the heart, so in the periphery. So we have to have an increase in that blood pressure in the periphery for us to be on a safer level. So if we've got this pressure, this intrathoracic pressure, pushing down on the vessels around the heart as well as on the heart, we need to regulate that blood pressure within the heart and within those vessels and within that periphery to then be similar to the intrathoracic pressure. So, that being the case, the body ends up decreasing the venous return through the vena cavas. So the vena cavas, those vessels end up decreasing in size and end up squeezing themselves shut. So the inferior vena cava right here in blue and the superior vena cava end up closing their lumen, so that we've got less significant decrease in that blood return back to the heart, which then that leads the body to then have to force blood into the periphery. So if you've got an increased blood volume in that periphery, that means that then you have an increase in your blood pressure throughout the body. So you don't just have an increase in blood pressure around the heart, but you have an increase in blood pressure around the periphery, which means that this air pressure, this intrathoracic pressure, is then equaled by the internal pressure of the periphery and the heart. So this equilibration system is a way to protect the system from the entire body from having these bursts, these breaks in the vasculature. Okay, stage 3 is this cool down phase. So first, in terms of intrathoracic pressure, we actually see an opening of this glottis, which then allows air back out, which then decreases the pressure inside of the body. So what happens? Of course, the internal mechanisms of the body then have to attenuate for that again. So again, in stage 2, we had a closing of that vena cava, a pinching of that vena cava, or both of those vena cavas, which then led to a decrease in that heart, in the amount of blood that was going to the heart, and an increase in the blood pressure throughout the vasculature. However, now because we have a decrease in that intrathoracic pressure, that means that we have to reopen this vena cava, the inferior and superior vena cava, to allow blood flow back into the heart, which means that then we have a sudden decrease in the blood pressure in the vasculature. Now, that's not that much of an issue. However, it is an issue when we're talking about the head, and we'll go over that a little bit more in detail in the next section. But real quick, one of the issues with that is if you have a sudden drop in blood pressure, because again, you have to equilibrate for this drop in intrathoracic pressure, which is outside of the vasculature, inside that closed circulatory system. You want to see a decrease, an equal decrease in blood pressure to attenuate, so that you don't have, again, these ruptures in that blood pressure, or in the vasculature. So you see this drop in blood pressure, and this especially affects the head, because if you've ever experienced a Valsalva maneuver, near the end, when you release again, you suddenly kind of have this blackened vision, or you might pass out, which is called syncope. And that can certainly occur, and that's because we have this sudden hypotension, this sudden decrease in blood pressure in the vasculature. And finally, in stage 4, which is our recovery stage, or our full recovery stage, we've got this change in intrathoracic pressure that's already over. We have this decrease in blood pressure leading to hypotension, so a low, extremely low blood pressure, which can end up in us actually becoming unconscious. And of course, the body can't allow us to just stay in that state. So it has this sudden sharp decrease in blood pressure throughout the entire system. And in stage 4, what it ends up doing is then re-increasing that blood pressure to kind of, in a panic system, tries to re-increase that blood pressure to attenuate for that sudden drop in blood pressure. So the sudden drop in blood pressure is to make sure that we equilibrate with this intrathoracic pressure, but then this reintroduction of an increase in blood pressure is done through an overshoot principle in the heart. So the heart ends up increasing its cardiac output by increasing by 40% that output, which ends up putting a massive amount of strain on the vasculature. So suddenly we now have a quick spike in blood pressure until everything can normalize again. And due to this, it's actually in stage 4 that we see the highest risk of stroke, because those vessels in the brain are very thin and can't necessarily handle a sudden overshoot, an increase in blood pressure at the beginning of Valsalva, then a sudden massive decrease in blood pressure once Valsalva is over, and then suddenly another increase in blood pressure through this overshoot principle. And actually, now that we're talking about stroke, we can go ahead and move on to the next section. So we discussed how in stages 3 and stages 4 that there is a significant impact on the brain, and I kind of wanted to specifically look at that mechanism and how the Valsalva maneuver has a profound impact on the brain and how the brain is able to react to that. So the reason why there's a high risk of stroke and a high risk of falling unconscious due to a sudden drop in blood pressure in stage 3, and then in stage 4 a sudden rise in blood pressure. These sharp changes can act on the small vasculature that's found inside the brain. So this small vasculature is more prone to breaking and leading to hemorrhagic stroke. Then that might make one assume that, okay, well then the Valsalva is definitely bad for the brain. And by itself, yes, I would probably agree with you. However, there is a protective mechanism that the brain specifically uses in times when we have an increase in this overall blood pressure in the body. And that principle is called the Monroe-Kelly principle. So the Monroe-Kelly principle is made up of 3 different factors. And basically it states that if we have an increase in pressure of one of these factors or 2 of these factors, the third factor will then decrease to attenuate that increase in blood pressure. So then to normalize that blood pressure, or not just blood pressure, but just pressure in general. And the 3 factors are brain tissue. So number 1 being brain tissue, the second one being blood delivery, which would be through those baroreceptors in the carotid arteries, and the third one being cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the first one, the brain, can't necessarily be manipulated a whole lot, but it does add to that pressure because of its mere existence. However, if you end up having some sort of inflammation, for example, that could upregulate the pressure a tad bit. However, what we do know is that the carotid arteries, just like those vena cava in the Valsalva for the main part of the body, the carotid arteries actually decrease as well in size. On the other hand, also we have a decrease in the cerebrospinal fluid, or we have a manipulation of that cerebrospinal fluid as it goes into the spinal canal. So these mechanisms are then able to kind of control, although we have a massive increase in blood pressure throughout the body, these carotid arteries, for one, through that baroreflex, are able to then control the amount of blood and therefore the amount of blood pressure that's going up into the brain. But that's not the only thing that changes. We also have a change in that cerebrospinal fluid to then further decrease the impact on the brain. So in healthy individuals, if we're talking about healthy individuals, are you going to see a sudden breakage in a sudden stroke in those people? Most likely not, because their mechanism for controlling that overall blood pressure in the brain is going to be better than a person who has an unhealthy mechanism or is somehow has cardiovascular disease, for example. So elderly people and people with cardiovascular disease are at a higher risk of their Valsalva maneuver leading to issues, but healthy individuals tend to be on the safer side. That doesn't mean that there aren't risks with the Valsalva maneuver, and those are outlined in my article below. However, again, if you're healthy, most likely the risks are minimal. This is the summary of the video for those of you that need a quick recap. If not, please subscribe and check out the attached article. Alrighty, for you guys that did not want to go through the entire video, the summary section is here for you. We talked about what the Valsalva maneuver is, and it is the creation of pressure in that intra-abdominal wall compared against the intra-abdominal wall and the intrathoracic area, so the abs and the back, and we create that pressure by inhaling air and then closing our glottis and our throat and pushing up that air up against that glottis, which ends up leading to a rise in blood pressure. And then there are a whole lot of physiological occurrences that happen inside the body. You're going to have to watch that part of the video or read it below in the article. But a whole bunch of different things happen, and our blood pressure goes up and down and does all kinds of wacky things. And that's why it's assumed that the Valsalva maneuver is not a safe procedure. It's not something that is recommended, especially for clinical populations. And I would largely agree that the Valsalva maneuver does have a little bit of risk to it, and especially that risk is for people that are prone to stroke. So anybody that has cardiovascular disease or is prone to cardiovascular disease, as well as the elderly. So in terms of that, yes, resistance training individuals, people who use the Valsalva maneuver quite often, they typically need the Valsalva maneuver when they are training at loads of 80 to 85% or higher. So in that case, the Valsalva maneuver is useful, but again, if you have cardiovascular disease, or you are in that elderly population, or you have just other symptoms related to that could diminish your health, for those people, it would not be recommended for you to train over 80%. And I think most clinicians would probably agree with that. At least one of those reasons being the Valsalva maneuver, because if you are forced, your body's forced to go into that Valsalva to control, to create that stiffness in your spine, to create that pressure to be able to control the weight, then it might not be for your best interest. And you can still, of course, make great results using intensities lower than 80% anyways, which in those cases at intensities lower than 80%, would you see a decrease in force production between using the Valsalva maneuver and not using the Valsalva maneuver? The evidence seems to point towards no. So the benefit of the Valsalva maneuver would only be seen at 80 to 85% and higher, supposedly. Now, of course, you could certainly argue different points on that. That is that. So that's the video. That's what I've got to say. If you'd like to check out my sources, if you'd like to check out the information that I got, even in far more detail than I even explained in the video, then I've got an article that I wrote down below. And if you found the video informational, please subscribe. It certainly means quite a bit to me. Share the video, like the video, get on out there and send out that evidence-based revolution. Everything is evidence-based, everything is peer-reviewed. So, and I take a lot of pride in my work. Hopefully you guys are able to get some information out of it just like I am. Alright, so without further ado, I will catch you in the next video. I hope that you have an awesome day. Go have an awesome day!